Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the workshop this morning. We're going to be speaking about the role of KTE in the application of Indigenous data sovereignty. In this session, we will review the principles of Indigenous data sovereignty and self-determination and explore knowledge translation and exchange as an application of these principles. My name is Sujitha Ratnasingham, and I will be facilitating this workshop. I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships at ICS and the operational lead of the Indigenous portfolio. I'm also part of a settler family. I was born in Sri Lanka and immigrated to what is now known as Toronto. Excuse me. I live here with my husband and two wonderful boys. As this research forum is virtual, we have participants situated across the province, country, and even the world. As one way to demonstrate our commitment to reconciliation, I would like to start this session with a territorial and treaty acknowledgement. I am situated on the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Anishinaabe, including the Chippewas and the Mississaugas of the Credit. I am thankful to be able to work and live in these territories where I am a guest. Toronto is within the territory of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, which requires responsibility of those who use the land to share it peacefully and care for it. I want to recognize and honor the ongoing presence and history of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities on this land. As I continue my learning journey, I've had the tremendous opportunity to work with and learn from incredibly bright, passionate, and wise First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. This includes two of our speakers this morning. I also have had the opportunity to reflect on the history of colonization, its ongoing impacts, and ways by which my family and I have benefited from these colonial structures. I've also learned the role each of us can and must play towards reconciliation. One of the first being learning and listening. With that, I would like to introduce our speakers. First, we have Dr. Jennifer Walker, who is the Indigenous Advisor at ICS and a senior scientist. We also have Maureen Gustafson, who is a knowledge translation and exchange specialist for Mamow Ahyamowen, a First Nations data alliance serving organizations and communities across Northern Ontario. Next, we have Christina Vlahopoulos, who is a project manager also with Mamow Ahyamowen, and Aggie Mazzucco, who is a project manager and research assistant, with the Prenatal Opioid Exposure and Neonatal Abstinence Syndrome Project. And this is a research project with 13 First Nations communities in Ontario. Today, we'll be starting off with a poll that's already open, and thanks to those that have already started completing it, followed by an overview of Indigenous Data Sovereignty and KTE by Maureen and Jen. And then we'll highlight two exemplar projects. First, Mamow Ahyamowen, which will be discussed by Christina and Maureen, followed by the Prenatal Opioid Exposure and Neonatal Abstinence Syndrome Project, which Aggie will speak to. And finally, there will be an opportunity for discussion and questions from the audience. So just looking over at the poll right now, we can see that most of the folks here are not working with an Indigenous organization or nation, but we do have at least a few folks that are here from an Indigenous organization or nation, which is great. In terms of experience with KTE, most folks have some experience, but not a lot. And then finally, with respect to KTE in Indigenous research, we have most folks here not having a lot of experience at all. So that's really helpful for us as we go through the rest of the presentation. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jen to speak about Indigenous data sovereignty.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jen Walker. I'm Haudenosaunee and a member of the Six Nations of the Grand River. And I also am an associate professor at McMaster University. And I've been helping with the Indigenous portfolio, advising the Indigenous portfolio at ICS, and was leading it for a long time. So I'm excited to be here and sharing a few thoughts on Indigenous data sovereignty and how KTE and knowledge translation and exchange approaches when done appropriately, can really help to advance Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous sovereignty in research overall. So when I'm talking about Indigenous data sovereignty, I'm referring to the right of Indigenous peoples and nations to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their own data. So that reflects both a right, Indigenous data sovereignty reflects both a right and a responsibility of Indigenous nations. So I often draw on this quote that I didn't hear myself, but saw, and it's, "The act of knowing is a collective, cultural, and political imperative for Indigenous peoples. Information, data, and research about our peoples, collected about us, with us, or by us, belongs to us and must be cared for by us." So this refers to that responsibility. It's not just the assertion of a right, it's also the recognition of a responsibility that Indigenous peoples and nations have to govern the data that is collected about us, with us, or by us. So if you think of spaces where you know about data or work with data, if it's about Indigenous peoples, even if it's not collected with or by Indigenous peoples, it's still Indigenous nations have the responsibility. So part of what we need to make sure we're doing is setting up our research and data structures to enable Indigenous nations to enact their sovereignty. Some of this is grounded, some of the way I think about this is grounded in this teaching around the two-row wampum. So at the beginning, Sujitha mentioned the dish with one spoon treaty. This is another agreement that's depicted in a wampum belt that refers to basically helps us to understand what Indigenous self-determination means. So this agreement was between Dutch settlers and Haudenosaunee nations, and it basically refers to a river and two vessels taking their own tracks along that river. So the boat with all the settlers' knowledge, experience, languages, family structures, governance structures in that ship. And the canoe or vessel that the Haudenosaunee nations were in that represents all the knowledges, language, family structures, governance structures of the Haudenosaunee people, and that those can travel in the same river without interfering, without crossing lines, without jumping into and out of each other's boats. So that non-interference and sovereignty is very foundational. But what's equally important is those white spaces and the spaces in between where we can find those spaces to work together, to support one another, and to learn from each other. So when I'm thinking about the rights side of Indigenous sovereignty, drawing on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a good sort of starting point. There are several articles. The whole thing is about self-determination for Indigenous nations around the world. And it's all really, there are some articles that really apply when we're thinking about research, KTE and research, Indigenous data sovereignty, and these are some of them. Some of them include the right to autonomy and self-government, to having distinct political, legal, economic, social, and cultural institutions. So really honoring those outside of the colonial structure, those institutions that are for First Nations, that are by First Nations, that are for Métis, that are by Métis, that those governance structures and institutions are integral to be honoring in the process of doing research and knowledge translation from that research. So I'm not going to go through all of these. I could do probably a whole session on this, but just to really ground us in thinking about what these rights mean. The other thing that I want to highlight for you, especially if you're a researcher or you have a need to communicate with researchers about the responsibility of researchers. So I talked about the responsibility that Indigenous nations have that is inherent in the sovereignty, but also researchers have a responsibility to do appropriate engagement with relevant communities. So in the Tri-Council policy statement, that is the sort of foundational document by which all research ethics involving humans in Canada is judged. So when we apply for Research Ethics Board approval, it's the Tri-Council policy statement that provides the guidance for research ethics boards to decide. And it's very clear, actually, that if the research is likely to affect the welfare of an Indigenous community or communities, researchers shall seek engagement. And that includes research in which Indigenous identity or membership in Indigenous community is used as a variable for the purpose of analysis of research data. And I pulled that one out because at ICES, that's sometimes the way it works. People often think, well, this is administrative data. It's already been collected. We're using it in a secondary way. So the Indigenous identifiers can be included in the models, but don't necessarily require the whole engagement because we're not collecting any new data. But that is not the case. It does require adequate engagement. And in the second article there, you can see that the extent and nature of that community engagement should be determined jointly by the researcher and the relevant community. So there is no formula. There's no recipe book for how that's done, but it should be appropriate to the community characteristics and the nature of the research. And so sometimes that looks like very in-depth engagement, co-design, co-development, and sometimes it looks like approval to do a project and that maybe the community has a different kind of capacity for being involved in the research, but that has to be determined jointly. So what that brings us to is this idea that we, in this kind of research, even if we are thinking about individual consent and we have reasons why we don't need individual consent because data are collected in a way that already has individual consent for the use of the data, or because it is exempt from requiring individual consent for research, there is still a requirement of collective consent, that Indigenous communities and nations have that authority to, and the researcher has the responsibility to make sure that there's collective consent beyond the individual consent for research. So thinking about all those ideas around Indigenous data sovereignty, we then have to make that real. We then have to make it into, we have to translate that into something that we can work with that helps us to operationalize Indigenous data governance. And when I'm talking about Indigenous data governance, there's two parts to that. This is a formula. You knew you'd get a formula at some point. No, I'm just kidding. It's not a formula, but it does require us to be thinking about Indigenous governance of Indigenous data and also the Indigenous use of that data for governance. So it requires governance of data and the use of the data for governance. So the use of the data for governance means that there has to be responsible and adequate knowledge sharing in a way that's actionable, in a way that can inform governance and policy. So there's a few frameworks for thinking about this. Broadly, internationally, there's a set of principles called the CARE Principles for Indigenous Data Governance. You can see we were there. This group drafted the first set, and I've had the real honor of being part of this drafting of the first set of these principles at a conference, and they've really started to become something internationally that other countries, that Indigenous nations can use in other countries. Next slide. I just think I have a little bit more detail on what those CARE principles are. You can always go and look them up, but really talking about the collective benefit, the authority of Indigenous peoples to control data and access, the responsibility for positive relationships, for expanding capacity, and also this ethics, making sure that we are thinking about all of the Indigenous ethics from an Indigenous perspective. The next slide. So there's another set of principles that has emerged that's specifically for Indigenous population health data linkage. These principles, these seeds principles, and this imagery of like building something and beating together to create something, a new picture, is sort of symbolic of that population health data linkage. And these principles include self-determination, exercising sovereignty, ethics, data stewardship and governance, and supporting reconciliation. So drawing on these principles, they have the same sort of themes. They're sort of thinking in a similar way, but they're guidance for Indigenous communities to speak with researchers and data holders, and they're also guidance for data holders to understand what they need to have in place. Coming closer to home, so I was talking internationally there, coming closer to home, First Nations have been way ahead. A lot of these other principles have drawn on the foundational work that First Nations have done in Canada since the 1990s and even before, around the principles of OCAP. So these principles, if you sort of started with the CARE principles, eventually you'd come to the OCAP principles anyway, because those are the principles that most First Nations will put forward for their data governance principles. And this refers to the rights of First Nations communities to own First Nations data, to control their data, to access their data, and to possess their data. And you can see a link there for training. This is something, I think the training might be on pause currently, but there's training available, really excellent training to help people orient to the OCAP principles. Training offered by First Nations Information Governance Center, which has also launched a national First Nations data governance strategy. And so regions across Canada, so wherever you are, if you're in Canada, across Canada, whichever First Nations regional sort of coordinating body is in your area, is involved in this First Nations data governance strategy and rolling that out over the next few years to strengthen capacity for data governance from a First Nations perspectives. At ICES, we've tried to make this real by centering Indigenous data governance principles, but also having data governance. So those OCAP principles would be in the center if we're working with First Nations data, and then having both data governance agreements in a formal and legal sense, and also maintaining those ethical relationships. So this is just a visual expressing the sort of evolution of those data governance agreements, we are just sort of at the point of having a renewed data governance agreement as well. So I think moving into the ideas around how this impacts knowledge translation and exchange, we should be thinking about how Indigenous data sovereignty and governance challenges those deficit approaches to telling stories with data. So there's been really harmful impacts of deficit-based approaches that perpetuates narratives of despair, difference, and deprivation, and then actually create an increased risk for Indigenous people who are seeking care. So what we need to move to is it moves away from using data to shine a light on problems and just continue to tell the story of deficits, to Indigenous peoples using the data to find and guide a path forward. So that using data for governance, for decision making. Pass to Maureen.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. That was a really good way to start us off, I think. Before I jump into this piece around knowledge translation, I'm just going to take a minute to introduce myself. So, Ani Maureen Ahyamowen. What I just said in my language means hi. My English name is Maureen. I'm a member of Couchiching First Nation, which is in Treaty 3 territory, and I grew up nearby there in a town called Fort Francis. I'm really privileged to serve as the Knowledge Translation Specialist for Mamow, Ahyamowen, as Sujitha mentioned earlier, and I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But for now, we're going to go over some basic info about KT from both health research academic kind of perspectives as well as Indigenous perspectives. And I'll be making the case, building on what Jen already shared, for why KT, or knowledge translation, is really inseparable from this concept of Indigenous data sovereignty. So we did see in the poll a lot of you have some experience with KT, which is great. I'm sure lots of you have heard the standard CIHR definition, which is that it's the process of strategically putting research findings into action in order to improve health systems, policies, and programs. So basically what I share with family members who aren't really involved in research is we're trying to make sure research isn't just sitting on a shelf and collecting dust, or these days you'd be sitting in a database collecting virtual dust. I don't know. But that's what it's all about in a nutshell, right? And I'm sure that's something that we can all kind of relate to when we think about the work that we're doing. We want it to matter. Next slide, please. So there are two broad approaches to KT. End of grant, which is essentially waiting until your research project is over or almost over to start thinking about sharing the results. And then there's integrated KT, which we sometimes call IKT, and that's embedding the idea of knowledge translation throughout your entire research project from the beginning, including the conceptualization phase to the end. Next slide, please. Oh, you're on top of it, Sujitha. Great. So we'll dive a bit deeper into the difference between these two approaches. Really briefly, end of grant has been standard in academia for a long time. That's slowly changing at different paces depending on what area you work in. It's not inherently bad, but it does mean that you're not engaging with knowledge users until late in your project, which means you're missing out on the opportunity to tailor it to their needs. And that goes back to the idea I talked about earlier regarding research collecting dust. For this reason, it's not always appropriate depending on who you're working with and what you're looking at. And I hope it'll be more clear in regard to the context we're talking about by the end of this little piece of the presentation. In contrast, integrated knowledge translation is again about meaningfully engaging knowledge users from the very start of the project. So generally this produces research that's actually more likely to be applied because the people who are going to use it are telling you what they need, which makes sense, right? Because you're engaging stakeholders as equal partners, and in some cases we don't like to use that word stakeholders, but generally engaging people or communities as equal partners, this aligns really well with ethical principles for research in Indigenous communities. I use this term somewhat interchangeably with the term KTE, knowledge translation and exchange, in the title of our presentation. So just want to clarify that in case I kind of slip up. Integrated knowledge translation and exchange is very similar integrated knowledge translation, very similar to knowledge translation and exchange. Again, the key similarity is that we're engaging knowledge users throughout the research cycle and that it's a reciprocal exchange between the two parties, not just a one-way transfer of information. So we also have this other definition on the screen, and this is a definition that was created by Indigenous scholars in recent years, and it kind of shares an Indigenous understanding of what KT could mean. So they say that it's sharing what we know about living a good life. And this acknowledges that Indigenous people have always practiced our own forms of KT in order to promote well-being in our communities. This is really important to keep in mind, both in general and obviously in the context of our presentation. I did forget to include the reference here, so apologies for that, but it's from a report by Drs. Janet Smiley and Neely Kaplan-Mirth called Sharing What We Know About Living a Good Life. That's published in 2006 if you want to look it up. So there is actually a whole field of work and writing around Indigenous KT. That could be a whole presentation. I'll try and go over some highlights here. This really emphasizes that our communities have, again, been practicing KT long before the concept actually gained traction in academia. And briefly, this stems from major philosophical kind of differences about the nature of knowledge and how we actually come to know what we know, which is sometimes referred to as epistemology. According to Indigenous epistemologies, knowledge can't really be separated from action. It would make absolutely no sense to have knowledge and not to share it, because this actually would be a threat to our collective survival and well-being. And because of these differences in epistemology, it is important to acknowledge that KT needs tend to be approached differently, need to be approached differently in Indigenous communities than in mainstream academic contexts. We have unique knowledge pathways that need to be respected and honored in order to effectively share knowledge. And there's also variation within and between communities. As always, we are not a monolith. So all this is really to say, in a nutshell, that we need to tailor research and knowledge sharing to communities' needs. In order to do this successfully, we also need to think about KT from the onset of a research project, again, going back to that integrated KT perspective, and engage with each other as equal partners. So I'll share some quotes in the next slides to kind of hopefully hammer that point home. I think that I'll let you guys read the quotes. You can read, I think, and I'll just do a bit of chatting about it. This quote really just points out and reinforces what I was saying earlier, that in Indigenous context, knowledge and action can't be separated. Like when you talk to some elders about this, they'd say, well, why would we ever need knowledge translation? Because there is no point of having knowledge and not sharing it. Of course, there are specific conditions and practices around when and how we share that knowledge, but it's always shared because, again, we work as a collective to take care of each other. And if we aren't sharing that knowledge, that way of life is not going to work. Next slide, please. This quote is from a recent systematic review of knowledge translation in Indigenous health research. So if you're interested in this topic, I would highly encourage you to read that. The authors state that research without practical relevance or application basically has no merit or value. And I think that this is a really powerful quote and makes a strong statement about research and what's worthwhile from a community perspective and what's not. So we just want to reemphasize this point. Not only are knowledge and action inseparable, but research that doesn't honor this would essentially be in some contexts worthless for a lot of Indigenous communities. So let's think back to what Jen shared. If Indigenous data sovereignty is about the rights of Indigenous people to collect, manage, and apply data in a way that aligns with their laws, practices, and customs, and now we know that meaningful KT, or sharing what we know about living a good life, is an inherent and integral aspect of Indigenous epistemologies, then it follows, this is the argument I'm trying to make anyways, it follows that you can't really honor Indigenous data sovereignty without thinking really carefully about the KT piece and honoring the Indigenous, the Indigenous understandings, plural, of KT. So again, the concepts are really just inseparable. And now that we've reviewed Indigenous data sovereignty, KT, and how the two relate, I'm going to hand it back over to Jen to go over some tools that will hopefully be able to help you approach this and understand things from a more practical perspective.
Yeah, we just wanted to make sure that we're leaving you with ideas, but also next steps. And one of the opportunities is this Indigenous Community Research Partnerships course. If you're a researcher, or maybe if you're an Indigenous organization who wants to understand what researchers need to know, then Indigenous Community Research Partnerships course has been developed as a way to orient people to some of these concepts in a deeper way. It's free to access. Another free to access resource has been produced by the Saskatchewan Centre for Patient-Oriented Research and the First Nations University of Canada. Training is offered through the First Nations University of Canada, and it's called the Indigenous Research Level of Engagement tool. This tool was I think essentially initially developed as a way to evaluate, like if you were on a review committee, to evaluate the level of engagement and the expectations around engagement in Indigenous research, could you go to the next slide, because I think it zooms in a little bit, and highlights that one of the key criteria for assessing the appropriateness and extent of Indigenous engagement is knowledge into practice. So it's integrated into the quality of the engagement. And just one more slide, because I think it just zooms right in. And really just so you can access this tool, you can access training around this tool, and it helps to give some examples of the sort of engagement activities around knowledge into practice that can be integrated into projects. So we're going to pass now to, sorry, Sujitha, are you going to?
No, you go ahead, Jen.
I'll mute, you go.
Thanks so much, Jen and Maureen, for that overview. So now we'll get into the exemplar project, starting with an overview of how Ahyamowen has incorporated these principles. So I'll turn it over to Maureen and Christina. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sujitha. And I'm just about to put a link in the chat box to what I'm about to talk about. Hopefully that works. It's not working, so maybe I'll put in the link in the chat box after I'm done my part. So good morning, everyone. And as previously mentioned, my name is Christina. I'm of Settler Greek ancestry, and I'm coming to you from the Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory and the traditional lands of the Atikameksheng, Anishinaabeg, and Wanapitei First Nations, also known as Sudbury. I'm honored to be here today to talk about Ahyamowen and how KTE plays a role in the work that Maureen and I do. So Ahyamowen loosely translates to meaning everyone's voices. Back in 2016, 7 independent First Nations health service organizations came together out of the common recognition that leaderships of communities needed access to high-quality health data to make important decisions for their community, for advocacy, to assess trends, and make evidence-informed planning, programming, and policy decisions. And since 2016, Ahyamowen has grown to include these 11 organizations on this slide, and collectively they serve 78 communities across Northern Ontario. These organizations are a blend of health authorities, tribal councils, and health and social service organizations. The Alliance itself is not a legal entity, and it's governed by a steering committee made up of 2 representatives from each of these organizations. The group uses a consensus-based model for decision-making. And for those of you familiar with the constellation model of collaborative social change, that would be a good description of how the Alliance works, bringing together steering committee members from these organizations to work towards common goals. So as mentioned, Ahyamowen serves 78 communities across Northern Ontario. And on this slide, you're going to see a map highlighting those 78 communities. And as you might notice, the geography is quite vast, and it includes communities from the Ontario-Quebec border to the James Hudson's Bay coast and across to the communities that border Manitoba. Early on, Ahyamowen decided that it wanted the voice to be a Northern Ontario-focused voice. And it decided that it would include only the communities as far south as those along the north shore of Georgian Bay, or the communities between Sudbury and Sault Ste. Marie. This is because the needs of the communities in the northern part of the province are unique compared to those in the southern part. So as an example, most of the year, many of the communities are only accessible by plane, and some of them have ice roads only available in the winter months. So if we take that map and we overlay a map of Western Europe, you can get a better appreciation of that vastness that I was just talking about for the geography. And while there may be some similarities across Northern Ontario, it's important to note that the needs of the people within the communities of the various regions are going to be unique. So as a good example, a person who lives in Italy wouldn't have the same healthcare needs or access to health services as someone, say for instance, in the northern part in Netherlands or France. So this image just really highlights that it's important that we do not paint all communities across Northern Ontario with the same brush and expect their needs to be identical. And this is especially important, for example, for policymakers who may not necessarily understand the vastness and challenges for those living in Northern First Nations. So things like access to healthcare or specialized services, the high cost of living, these and other factors are going to be different across the communities. So now that we established what Ahyamowen is and placed a bit of a foundation for what we do or for who we are, so then becomes a question of what do we actually do? So we work with communities to find, analyze, and interpret data in response to questions that they have and have prioritized following a culturally respectful path. So when the group first came together, they identified many areas that they wanted to explore using data. So topics like diabetes, cancer, and mental health were all priorities for the group. After initial meetings, collectively, the group decided that they wanted to start by looking at the mortality experience of members served by Ahyamowen and the types of chronic diseases that they had when they passed away. They thought that this would be a good place to start because this analysis would touch on many of the priorities that they identified. So if you notice on this slide, it says 59 out of 74 communities opted into this analysis. And this is a very important point and comes back to what Jen was talking about and what Maureen was also talking about in terms of KTE. And what this means is in order to access the community data through ICS, we needed to have the community's approval. Communities had the decision-making power to determine if they wanted to participate in the analysis. It's also important to note that the work done by Ahyamowen was not and is not researcher-driven. This was all driven by the communities and the organizations themselves. So the group identified the research question, reached out to researchers and ICS for assistance to access the data that they were looking for, and used health administrative data to answer their question. And now I'm going to turn it over to Maureen to talk about how we took the data from ICES and shared the findings with the organizations and communities that make up Ahyamowen.
Thanks, Christina. So when it came to sharing the results from the mortality analysis, it was really important for us to put a lot of time and effort into this because, again, as Christina mentioned, this data belongs to them, not to us. And so if we're not sharing it in a way that's meaningful and allows for them to use it, data for governance, like Jen said earlier, we're not doing our job and there's no point in doing the work. So in terms of knowledge products or physical products that actually communicate findings, we did put together a few things. We created several different types of reports, which you can see on the screen. So the maroon is the report for all participating communities across the Alliance, and that's available on our website. The green reports were created for each organization or region. Blue reports were for individual communities where possible. Sometimes numbers were too small to create those, but we did do it wherever we could. We also created what we called companion reports, which is the landscape style report on the bottom there. And these allowed organizations and communities to understand how they were doing in relation to one another. And we did that by assigning each one a random number so that they would remain anonymous, but still be able to understand where they lied for each variable we looked at. And before I move on to the other products, I just want to emphasize that only the Alliance level report is available on our website. All the other reports belong to their respective organization or community, and they are the only ones who get to decide what to do with them or who to share them with. So if we get an email from someone who wants to look at the report for one of the organizations, let's say in Northwestern Ontario, that's not up to us to decide. We refer them to the steering committee members for that organization, and they make the decision because, again, it's their data. Let's see here. We also put partner and community level findings into slide decks, which I'll talk about more in a minute. We're currently working on a whiteboard video that we hope will help share the findings with a broader audience. So the reports we see as being for people like health directors and chief and council, maybe for use in funding applications, things like that. But the whiteboard videos will probably be more accessible for community members or other folks who might not be interested in reading a long report, although some might, but I can't say I blame them if they wouldn't. As many of you know, writing a report or putting together slide decks often isn't enough, though. We actually need a way to disseminate or share those knowledge products with our audiences. So we wanted to engage different audiences in ways that would help organizations and communities achieve their objectives, because again, this is about them. The first step was to share the findings back with them. And we did this with the slide decks that I mentioned earlier, which we shared during interactive workshops and presentations. And doing this allowed people the opportunity to ask questions and to talk about what the results meant to them. So they were really more like co-interpretation sessions, because their lived experience really added so much more to our understanding of those numbers. Some organizations asked us to do things like press releases in order to help raise awareness about the health inequities that the analyses uncovered. And we've presented at academic conferences in order to reach researchers and other folks. We recently held a webinar with the National Collaborating Center for Indigenous Health. I think Christina is going to pop the link for that in the chat box, so you can take a look at that. It does go deeper into the actual results from the analysis. Unfortunately, we don't have time for that today, but it is really interesting, so I'd highly encourage you to check it out if you want to. And finally, the steering committee is currently considering if and how we might use social media to reach different audiences and to share specific knowledge products like the infographics we've made or whiteboard videos to help, again, meet those objectives. So within the past year, we've done some evaluation to figure out what we did well and what we could have improved on in terms of KTE for the mortality analysis. We really wanted to get a sense of if and how organizations and communities were using the data. And to answer these questions, we sent out a survey and we had small group discussions with each organization. What we learned from those things was that there were three broad themes in terms of how they were using the data, primarily the organizations. So almost every organization shared that they had used the data to apply for funding. And this ranged from one-off Jordan's Principle applications to larger, longer-term grants and projects. Most of these attempts were successful, which was really exciting for us to hear. And we're continuing to kind of keep an eye on that. Organizations also shared that they use this data to inform planning, and this ranged from high-level strategic planning with the entire organization, all the way to like logistics and program-level planning. And finally, the third category was kind of a catch-all term for the really unique ways that organizations use data to support localized initiatives. So for example, one organization told us that they use data to inform COVID-19 vaccine planning. They actually lowered the age at which their members were able to be prioritized for a vaccine. So instead of being 65 plus like the rest of the province, it became 55 plus. Another shared that they were using the data to make some changes to their IRS registration process. IRS refers to the Indigenous or Indian registry maintained by Indigenous Services Canada. And there are some other examples too, but yeah, those are just two examples of the unique ways that specific organizations were using data to do things in their region. In terms of next steps, the steering committee has directed us to start 3 more analyses. So they're going to focus on chronic conditions, mental health and addictions, and injuries. So we started these processes by outlining exactly what we wanted to learn versus what we could learn with the data that we're going to have access to through ICES. We also have completed the community opt-in process because, again, just because the community is part of our alliance doesn't mean that we can just do whatever we want with their data. We do need approval and permission from them. I'm looking at my notes here. It says 70 out of 78 communities. I'm not sure if that's current. So Christina, okay, she's nodding, so that's great. I couldn't remember if it had changed again or not, but 70 out of the 78 communities we serve have opted in, which I think is really telling in terms of the need for this data and how we're doing the work, and hopefully it means that communities think we're doing it in a good way. That's the hope. While conducting the evaluation I mentioned in the last slide, just really quickly, we also took the opportunity to start thinking about KTE for these upcoming analyses and what organizations wanted to achieve by sharing the results to develop knowledge translation plans that can guide all aspects of our work moving forward. So again, we're starting to think about this from the beginning, not at the end. A few months back, one of our organizations did help us hold ceremony to start the analyses in a good way, which we're really, really grateful for. And we've just started looking at some preliminary results from the chronic conditions and mental health and addictions analyses, which has been so exciting, especially because this process has been delayed a little bit for obvious reasons, mainly COVID over the last few years. So that's been really, really exciting and great to see. And we really look forward to seeing more results and starting to co-interpret those with organizations and eventually sharing them. So that was a lot. That's it in a nutshell. I'm going to turn it over to Aggie now to talk about another really cool project. Thank you.
Thanks, Maureen. Can everyone hear me? Okay. My name is Aggie, and I am of Italian, settler Italian ancestry, and currently living in the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and what is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, also known as Toronto. For the past 5 years, I have been working with community partners from 13 First Nations communities in Ontario, in the lower half of Ontario, and members of the core research team. Next slide, please. The Prenatal Opioid Exposure Project was born out of concerns raised by several First Nations communities about the health and wellness of school-aged children who were exposed to opioids prenatally, and their request for information to better meet their needs. And it is from this point that we began cultivating our research partnerships. Next slide, please. The project goals have been to build strong relationships with First Nations communities and to gather and share community and culturally specific information about the impacts of prenatal opioid exposure and neonatal abstinence syndrome. Next slide. From the beginning, there was a decision to create 2 arms to this research project, a quantitative arm and a qualitative arm. And this recognized that the numbers only told part of the story, and that the inclusion of community voices and perspectives could help provide a more fulsome picture of the impacts of prenatal opioid exposure in communities. For the quantitative research, we used existing health records information housed at ICS, and this information is governed by First Nations. We use this information to obtain rates and trends of prenatal opioid exposure and neonatal abstinence syndrome, as well as maternal and infant characteristics such as mother's age at delivery and baby's length of stay in hospital. For the qualitative research, we conducted focus groups and interviews that enabled community members to share their perspectives on the impacts of prenatal opioid exposure on babies and children, mothers, families and caregivers, service providers and educators, and the community as a whole. They also looked at the strengths of the communities that could be built upon and strategies to better support families and prevent prenatal opioid exposure. Next slide, please. In terms of our approach, we grounded ourselves in First Nations understandings of wellness and a strengths-based approach to research. And we use this research to shift from patterns of intergenerational trauma to intergenerational healing. Over the course of the project, community needs and interests were always center stage, and the principles of First Nations data governance were embedded throughout the research process. And it is with these perspectives that the core research team designed and implemented an integrated knowledge translation plan. Next slide, please. As part of an integrated knowledge translation approach, one of the critical success factors is the time and attention taken to cultivating trusting and respectful relationships where people feel informed, engaged, and heard. We did a lot of engagement events and certainly consultations with communities throughout the project. Community partners have informed and shaped all aspects of the project by championing the project and engaging decision makers at the local level, participating in engagement and planning sessions, helping to coordinate focus groups and interviews, as well as promoting the respect, privacy, safety, and well-being of community members, examining project materials, adapting research methods, selecting data elements, and also reviewing the knowledge translation activities and providing feedback about that as well. And overall, we're definitely key to ensuring that the research, helping to us to ensure that the research projects and processes were community and culturally appropriate. Next slide, please. Overall, community members were ready for truth-telling, eager to share their stories, and excited to share and use the findings to improve the health and wellness of the community, their community members. Next slide, please. The findings were vetted by community partners at every stage of the project to ensure that they supported their needs and interests. We also wanted to make sure that that the information was communicated in a clear manner, and to identify any concerns related to language and content, and to determine how the information would be disseminated. In the end, customized reports and presentations were produced for each of the 13 First Nations communities, as well as an aggregate report summarizing the findings across all communities. We also held discussions with each community regarding co-authorship and acknowledgements, and so provided them with information on some of the benefits of and risks related to co-authorship, and also for the acknowledgements, how they wanted to be acknowledged. We have been conducting community presentations, and this is again the communities telling us when they would appreciate this. And we also spent time meeting and discussing a communications plan, which included garnering written permission from all First Nations communities in the project to post the aggregate report on the ICS website for public access. So while communities will have the complete control over their community reports, there was a collective decision made to share the aggregate findings so that others can benefit. And community partners in these discussions also expressed an interest in having a media release and graphics. Again, this is a reflection of their desire for truth-telling and readiness for that, and because they were very proud to be addressing prenatal opioid exposure through this their participation in this project. Next, I wanted to share a few examples of some of the things that we paid attention to over the course of developing some of these knowledge translation products. So the first example is about the use of imagery. So the report, next slide, please. The report is emotionally difficult to read. And so as part of a trauma-informed and strengths-based approach, we intentionally used positive and soothing imagery, at times offering the reader a calming refuge into nature, the delight of a joyful mother or child, and her child, and a critical sense of hope. And I see we've advanced to the next slide. I will speak to this one. And this is about creating adaptable and transferable information. We can go to the next slide. Thanks, Sujitha. So the project team spent a significant amount of time planning, drafting, vetting, reflecting on, and then replanning how to best summarize and communicate the findings. For example, the quantitative findings, the aim was for the community partners to be able to obviously use information that they determined would be helpful to them to inform their planning, their program planning, strategic planning. But it was also very important for us to work on how to be able to organize the information in a way such that communities would be able to easily cut and paste the information from the reports and the PowerPoint presentations into funding proposals to strengthen their case for support, which is something that communities have already started to do. And one of our community partners has already had 2 successful funding proposals for community-based programs focused on supporting community members with living with addiction. So that's really great to see and rewarding for all of us. And the last example speaks to one of the knowledge translation objectives that we came to, and that was amplifying community voices. And so next slide, please. So this was accomplished by reflecting what we heard and working with each community to tell their story in their own words. So you'll see some examples here. Young people are dropping dead. Even community leaders' families are being impacted. I personally thought it would be the wake-up call for the community, but nope, we're waiting for the next funeral. I would have loved if somebody were to come to the hospital after I had my baby and just give me a hug. So really powerful statements that really honor the words from our participants. I really think going back to culture is probably the strongest thing that we have for our community. And last, I would like to kind of speak to some of where we're going. So as a next step, we're excited to have secured additional funding for phase 2 of the research project, and very pleased to report that all 13 communities are interested in moving forward with it. Next slide, please. So the focus of phase 2 will be on developing community-specific knowledge translation plans and co-developing a community of practice for all 13 First Nations communities that are participating in the project. This phase will be centered on research autonomy, First Nations rights to self-determination, and First Nations-led knowledge translation. And in keeping with these principles, a portion of the project funds will go directly to the communities to support their efforts in this phase. And the role of the project team will be to support communities individually and collectively in ways that our community partners tell us will be most helpful. So really putting community partners, again, as they were directing things in the first phase, putting them putting their needs and interests on the forefront, and them leading this next phase. And finally, a key takeaway, which I hope will stick with you as it did with me, is a variation on the quote by Elizabeth Medicine Crow that Jen used to begin her presentation. And it's by one of our core research team members, Brenda Johnson, who at the very first engagement session that we had, loud and clear, announced nothing about us without us. So with those closing words, I say thank you, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thanks so much, Aggie. And thanks so much to all our speakers. Jen and Maureen, you provided a wonderful overview of Indigenous data sovereignty and KTE as an application of that. And to Maureen, Christina, and Aggie for sharing with us 2 wonderful examples of how these principles can be applied. So now you've heard from our speakers, and it's really an opportunity for the audience to ask any questions that you may have. So I'll just pause. I think there's ways for people to raise their hands or put some questions in the chat as well. Great. So we have a question from Amani Hamad. If researchers want to use administrative data or an administrative data set that has an overrepresentation of Indigenous people, for example, in justice data, do you feel researchers need to engage these communities in the research even though they aren't using variables about Indigenous identity?
I can start with a response. Thanks for the question, Amani. So I think that, do I feel versus what can you get away with research ethics is a different question. So you technically, if there's a high proportion of Indigenous people, but you're not actually using Indigenous identity as a variable, I think probably, you technically, if you look at the Tri-Council policy statement, it might not fall into it. So, but we don't want research, to quote my colleague Julie Bull, we don't want research ethics to get in the way of ethical research. So I would say, yes, I think that if we're using data that tell the story of Indigenous populations and Indigenous nations, Indigenous peoples, then we need to be engaging, because the story can hurt people. The way the story is told has the potential to be harmful. And ethically, I think we feel a responsibility to do our research in a way that doesn't hurt people. And so my answer to that is would be a clear yes, but I know that lots of people do access those data without involvement, and I know that it's possible to do that. But I just, again, channeling Julie Bull, who's an Inuk scholar and poet, and she talks about how we shouldn't let the technicalities of research ethics processes get in the way of doing ethical research.
Thanks so much, Jen. I don't know if anyone else wanted to add to that or build upon it. Yeah, okay. We have another question. I don't know if I need to read all of them, but I can. From Lauren, and it's related to data sharing agreements. So she's asking, or they're asking, I wonder if any of you navigated data sharing agreements and or if you have any tips around that. Jen, this may be you again.
Yeah, so there's different layers of this that I certainly have navigated in terms of data governance agreements at ICES. So that's not a sharing agreement. We're not sending data out of ICES, but we're making sure that First Nations, in one case, are governing the data, and the Métis Nation, in another case, is governing the Métis data. So there's data governance agreements. There's sometimes data sharing agreements for different kinds of projects. And so, for research projects where there's data sharing, then those data sharing agreements really need to draw on OCAP. So usually, actually, there's several layers of agreements that for my university-based research, there'd be a collaboration agreement that would talk about the principles of how we're going to work together. And with Aggie's project, we had that. We had research agreements that talked about those principles, that we were going to work together and ground in OCAP and in the way that the values that we had about the research. So that kind of an agreement, and then usually a funding agreement, so that that communities have like practically they have the resources available to engage in the research, and then a data sharing agreement that's a very technical legal document about the transfer of data and things like that. So I don't know if that helps, but there are a lot of layers to it, and it does require, educating our institutions, educating our legal professionals and staff, and privacy professionals and staff at our organizations. I found one of the interesting comments that I had was from one really honest lawyer at one of the institutions I work with that just said, "We're trying to protect you and your intellectual property." And I was like, thank you so much. I don't need that protection. As a researcher, the research belongs to the communities. I don't know if Aggie, Christina, Maureen, if you have any additional thoughts.
Sure. I would say that the research agreements that we shared. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I would say that the core research team, the community research agreements, I think were very helpful at the beginning to outline clearly to chief and council who were trying to decide whether or not to approve the research, and for us to clearly define the roles and responsibilities, how we were going to work together, the principles that we were going to adhere to, the risks and benefits, as well as how the data was going to be secured. And so I think it's something that's very helpful in the early stages for clarifications, and so that we know what the roles are and expectations. And it's also something and obviously responsibilities mostly, and something that people can point to should there be an issue later on, that if there are any concerns. So I would highly recommend it.
Thanks so much, Aggie and Jen. I maybe have a follow-up question for the panel as well. So it sounds like for the prenatal opioid exposure project, there were researcher agreements. With the Ahyamowen projects, were there researcher agreements in place? I know it was driven by the Alliance, but working with a non-Indigenous institution.
Yeah, so because the Alliance is governed and led by First Nations, it's not 100% the same context, but we do have a relationship with ICES that enables to access the data that we need to answer our communities and organizations' questions. So this is where, and Jen can certainly add on to this after I'm done, but this is where the foundational work that the Chiefs of Ontario has done in partnership with ICES comes into play. So they've done a lot of work to ensure that First Nations can access data through ICES, linked with the Indian Registrar to understand, who in these data sets is Indigenous, or I guess First Nations rather. And the Chiefs of Ontario are the ones who set out how ICES should go about holding and sharing that data in a good way, in line with the Indigenous Data Sovereignty principles that Jen was talking about earlier. So Jen, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to share. Obviously, this is a pretty high level overview, but yeah, the context for us is just a little bit different. So awesome. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Maureen. So if I'm hearing it right, it's because of that partnership with the Chiefs of Ontario that created the protections so that you didn't feel the need to have additional kind of agreements in place.
Exactly. And because the work was community driven, we didn't necessarily need to have an agreement with researchers because it's the relationship between us and ICES with researchers who support the work, but not that are necessarily leading the work themselves.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
And maybe I'll just add one additional point. So when I mentioned earlier on about the community opt-in process, in order we had to have either a Band Council resolution, which is a signed document by chiefs and or leadership within a community, or the decision makers of the community. So whether it was a Band Council resolution or a Chiefs and Assembly resolution, Ahyamowen, as it stands, needs to have those approvals from the communities and the chiefs to be able to do this work. If a community wanted to directly work with ICES, I think the process is a little bit different, but because Ahyamowen itself isn't necessarily a community, we needed to have those approvals to make sure that we were doing the work in a good way.
Thanks so much, Christina. I see some additional questions. Okay, great. From Abigail, how do you handle data sovereignty for urban Indigenous populations and for data sets which only identify race or ethnicity and does not have information on status or nation membership? Jen, this may be... Oh, sorry, Maureen, go ahead.
That's okay. I was going to say I can take a stab at it, and certainly if Jen or anyone else wants to add to it, that would be lovely. I think it's important to keep in mind that there's still a huge presence in urban centers for Indigenous people, and there are also organizations that serve those communities, right? And so really the important piece would be to figure out which organizations are serving communities, if there is no way to understand what communities those folks are from, and to connect with them. So to give an example, when I was a graduate student, I was really lucky to be a part of a project called Our Health Counts, which was by the Well Living House based at St. Mike's. There was some linkage with ICES data for that, as well as a respectful health survey that they administered with participants. And so that Our Health Counts has happened, I think, now in a couple of different communities. I won't get too in depth. It's not my project to speak to, but I would really like to encourage people to look at that as an example of how this kind of question can play out in urban contexts. So, for example, in Toronto, when they did the study, I think the governance was primarily with 7 Generations Midwives, which is a First Nations or Indigenous midwifery practice. And I think that there was also some engagement with other organizations as well. But again, just highlighting this as an example that you could look at that uses ICES and health administrative data to kind of understand what was done there. So I'll hand it off to the other presenters to see if there's anything they want to add to that.
Maybe I'll just answer the second half of the question. Then thanks so much, Maureen, for that. That was answering the first part around data sovereignty for urban Indigenous populations, and then the second part was and for data sets which only identify race and ethnicity and does not have information on status or nation membership. So it's still required, like engagement is still required. The data sovereignty piece and the nation piece is a bit different if you don't know which nation, right? Like, so sometimes I've worked with organizations that say, well, if it's just a self-identified indigenous variable, or if it's part of a race and ethnicity variable, we don't know how to govern that because or it maybe we need to just know about it. So there's some diversity there in how Indigenous groups and nations want to be involved in that kind of data analysis. So asking is the first thing. So if it's a variable that has First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, asking First Nations, Inuit, and Métis in the region that is represented, then that's the first thing. And the second thing is that it doesn't, even if there's not like clear processes for governance, there needs to be governance in the research project or in the analysis. And it doesn't negate the need for engagement. So to get ethics approval, you should still need to do engagement if you're accessing First Nations, Inuit, and Métis identifiers. So one example I can give that recently we worked through is for the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging. So that's not at ICES, but through the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging, we worked through, they have a race and ethnicity variable. They have a couple of ways that you can find Indigenous identity responses in the questions. And so they asked, like, what should we do with this? So we kind of paused for several years, actually, while we figured it out, paused access to those those identity variables, not the whole variables, but just the Indigenous identity part of it. And then now put in place a process to review whether there's appropriate engagement and involvement and governance of the research project that is requesting access to those identity variables. So that's it, it's this distinction that governance and engagement go together, but they are distinct. So even in the absence of like clear governance, engagement still needs to be there.
Thanks so much, Jen. That one's for you, Jen. Around if you could elaborate a bit more on the Indigenous identity piece, individual versus community consent and consultation.
Maybe someone else needs to make, because I don't know what gaps I haven't covered. Like if I feel like I'll be repeating myself if I say it, but okay, maybe I'll start and someone else can help me if there's pieces that I'm being unclear about. But essentially, for, what the Tri-Council policy statement does is help us think through, we need to go beyond individual consent for research. So we're not just asking individuals, okay, so we do need individual consent, obviously. So if you're asking someone their Indigenous identity, you need, in a research project, you need to ask for consent to be part of the research project, and then they're answering that question. So you have individual consent, but using that information requires the collective consent. And ways that because you could be, people could have individually consented to put their data in, but then how this collective story is used requires collective consent. So that's the example of the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging, actually, where individuals were asked for consent and they answered the study questions and their data is sitting in the databases. But then when it's accessed to answer collective questions about aging in Indigenous communities, it requires a collective consent and engagement. Can someone else help if I need to elaborate more?
I wonder if maybe Christina or Maureen, you can speak to kind of the Ahyamowen example around the collective consent specifically, because I think that's a great example.
For sure, yeah. I mean, because we're using because we're using health administrative data, we're not really seeking out individual consent from the folks who are showing up in the numbers, and maybe that's why community consent is so important. But as Jen mentioned, community consent is still important even if you are just speaking with individuals. So I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah, as Christina mentioned earlier, we do require either a bound council resolution or a chiefs and assembly resolution, depending on who we're talking about, that clearly and explicitly states that community wants us to do this research. Again, like this is data that's about them, and it wouldn't be appropriate for us to go in and even to just look at the data, and most especially to talk about the data without their permission, right? So the way that works is going to vary. Again, for us, it's band council resolutions. And I don't know, in different contexts, there might be different kind of mechanisms for that. I don't know if there's anything else I'm kind of forgetting to talk about, Christina or Sujitha, but that's my answer in a nutshell.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add a little bit to that and the importance of what the language used in the band council resolution. So in order to do, as Maureen mentioned, we were directed to work on 3 additional analyses: a chronic disease analysis, an injury analysis, and a mental health and addictions analysis. We did all of this legwork to start the approval process, and this all happened right at the very beginning of the pandemic. So we had some approvals for some of the communities and regions, and of course we didn't have all of the approvals, and then the pandemic hit and everybody's priorities shifted immediately. And there was interest early on in doing work related with COVID-19 in the communities. And the challenge was the wording in the Band Council resolutions, because we had already received some of those approvals, didn't explicitly say anything about COVID-19. And so even though there was an interest from the steering committee, we didn't have that that approval from the community to say that we could do this work. And so because of that, we couldn't veer off of what the language said within that resolution that was signed by the chiefs of that community or the chiefs in assembly from that region.
Thanks, Christina. That's really a great example of, having to or trying to stick to that, what the community, their intent was in having that question come forward. I think we have a couple of minutes left. I see that there is a question in the chat around the approval process if a researcher wants to use Indigenous data in ICS databases. I would say this is probably a very nuanced question because it really depends on, what the data are, whether it's First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and as well if it's a direct or indirect identifier. So maybe this is a question that we can respond to afterwards if you don't mind emailing, and we can provide our contact information, unless anyone wants to briefly speak to that.
Maybe, Sujitha, I'll just say a couple of things. I can't describe the whole process probably right now, but just that there are sort of streams of, like we've talked about how the foundation that Chiefs of Ontario has set for the First Nations data enables First Nations to use the data, and there's a different kind of process there than if it's a researcher who's coming and asking. So there is an application process that is not ICES's process, but it's an application to a sorry, my voice is having a problem, to a data governance committee that's chaired and coordinated by Chiefs of Ontario. So there are different processes depending on the use of the data and the type of data, and that's just for the First Nations data. And as Sujitha mentioned, if it's Métis or Inuit data, there's also other processes. So I think it does sometimes require a little bit of an upfront conversation with the Indigenous portfolio at ICES. So that could be a helpful follow-up if it's something you're interested in. But regardless, there cannot be access to the data without community engagement and involvement and community governance of a project. So you should know that before you plan to access the data.
Thanks so much, Jen. And I've just put the contact information for the Indigenous portfolio in the chat if you have additional questions as well. I have one question for the panel, if that's okay. And it's around reciprocity. We know that that's key in Indigenous research. And given that KT or integrated KT, as Maureen outlined it, is a key element of reciprocity, how do you incorporate it into your work, and maybe even drawing from the examples that you've shared today?
For sure, I can start if that's all right. In terms of the Ahyamowen project, so again, the concept of reciprocity is a little bit different for us because of our governance structure and because we are community-led rather than a researcher and a community kind of coming together for a specific project. But we still do, of course, think about reciprocity in our work. Actually, I think it's a really important aspect of our work. So in terms of reciprocity, a really key piece of that in terms of like knowledge translation and exchange, like I mentioned earlier, or integrated knowledge translation is listening. And so when we talked earlier about kind of co-interpretation or looking at the numbers together, it's understanding and acknowledging that numbers can only tell us so much, and that the lived experience of community members actually adds so much depth to our understanding of what the findings do mean. In terms of reciprocity and KTE, again, I mentioned earlier, we work really hard to design KTE products and share these things in a way that's going to be meaningful and accessible for our communities. I talked about how we did a little bit of an evaluation in terms of our KTE for the previous analysis that we did on mortality in order to inform the upcoming work that we are doing. Some really cool things that came out of that briefly, which I didn't necessarily touch on earlier, are some new ways of sharing information that didn't really come out in the first analysis. So, for example, a couple of organizations shared that radio would actually be a good avenue to share information. Radio is a really important channel for a lot of communities across Northern Ontario, and it's something that we're hoping to help facilitate once we are ready to share findings. So whether that's us going on the radio or us developing scripts for people from the community to speak on the radio themselves, we'll do whatever we can to help ensure that, again, the information is being shared in a meaningful and appropriate way for that community. And that's, again, all in the way to honor reciprocity. And just briefly, in terms of a last point, we also think about reciprocity in terms of our work with ICES as well. So they provide us with data. They allow us to take the lead for KTE, which is really awesome. And I think they've also learned from Mamow, as Sujitha kind of mentioned earlier, and our experiences, which helps them to build their KT knowledge in working with Indigenous communities. We honor and respect their work and contributions and do what we can from our end to continue to just honor that and build our relationships. So reciprocity and relationships, I think, are really interconnected. You've heard me say that word quite a bit in my response to this question. And it's really, they're both at the heart of what we do. So I don't know if Christina wants to add anything or if we can hop right to Aggie to share a little bit about reciprocity in the context of the Prenatal Opioid Exposure Project.
I think we're at the end of the session. I wish I could share, but
I think you can probably, if you want to, just briefly, but if you're...
I won't, it's
no
okay.
Problem. Okay. Well, just to close off, I want to really thank all of you, Aggie, Christina, Maureen, and Jen, for your time and for sharing your knowledge. I think I always learn a lot when I'm in the room with all of you, and I'm sure the participants have as well. So thank you so much.